For those of you who don't know, Crowdsourcing is a Singapore-based crowdfunding platform. What we do is we offer reward-based crowdfunding, as you've heard the mechanics explained this morning. We're also paving the way to offer equity-based crowdfunding. We will be with the aim of becoming one of the first hybrid platforms. And we also work with big institutions, corporations, to see how they can actually leverage crowdfunding to spur their innovation. So what I'd like to do today is to share with you emerging trends. And I've actually changed the predicting the future to actually provocative thoughts. What I'd like to do is not tell you what the future is, but to share with you some provocations in terms of thinking what kind of future we could actually shape together in terms of crowdfunding here in the region. Now, before I go into the main presentation, I want to share with you two numbers. On the left-hand side, you'll see $2.7 billion. On the right-hand side, you'll see $2 billion. And I'll come back to what these numbers mean, but the key thing is to really stick through the presentation, use your imagination, see where the possibilities are to believe in the numbers and how I'll interpret them later on. So crowdfunding in Asia, let's look at it in a macro context. So Asia versus the world, internet population 45%, e-commerce spend 30%, Facebook population 25%. On these simple macro factors, Asia on its own is typically the single most biggest contributing region, or at minimum, the fastest growing one. So where is crowdfunding in Asia today? It's less than 1% of global fundraising, right? Every time I look at this number, something precious dies inside of my heart. Now, is the story really that bleak? And I think to understand that picture, we have to look at the story of two players. One is the local campaigners, and the other is the local platforms. So let's look at the story of the local campaigners first. Now, I'm happy to say that the last 6 months have been amazing in terms of the level of professionalism, the amount of monies raised, and the achievement and progress that local campaigners have made. So I think that in my memory at least, as someone who follows local campaigners very closely, it all started off with Kenny G. He did a fundraiser for film. He raised $29,000. And this was at a time when people were saying that, look, in Asia, no one gets this concept. You'll be lucky if you raise a few $1,000s. He defied convention, raised quite a good amount. And then we had Silverline, as Lauren presented earlier. Absolutely brilliant execution from strategy up until implementation, and they doubled that amount. That was quickly followed by a political cause here based in Singapore, which again doubled that amount, $101,000. And finally, we have later, I think someone from Pyro 3D talk about their experience as well. We have a campaign which is live right now, which has raised $700,000. So you see that the last 6 months have been record-smashing months across fields as diverse as film, technology, mobile, social causes, political causes, and hardware, right? So basically we're repainting and redefining convention here. Now, it's no secret, right, that all these campaigns have been launched on international platforms. So the second side of the story that you need to look at to understand the potential of crowdfunding is to look at the local platforms like ourselves. So, in a nutshell, where we lack scale, we're actually doing faster and better, and I'll tell you why. It's no secret that global platforms have a few-year head start on us, right? I think that in its most professional modern form, crowdfunding in Singapore, Southeast Asia, and Asia has only been around for 1 year, whereas globally, I think that it's been taken off more around 2009. If we do a like-for-like comparison in terms of what it is for us right now versus what it was like for the international platforms back when they started off, you actually see that first-year average listing, globally comparable, campaign target achievement, globally comparable, dollars raised for first successful campaign, we're actually smashing the record here, much, much bigger. And then there's no global comparison, but if you actually look at the cumulative amount of money raised on Crowdsourcing, for example, versus our predecessors and competitors in the region, you'll see that more dollars in less than half the time. So you see that on the local platform side, we're going better, faster, and bigger, and we're just not there in terms of scale yet because of the head start. Now, I often get this question that, can you actually make a globally relevant platform based out of Asia, right? And it's a great challenge. And what I'd like to do is just show you, for our platform, where the traffic, where the money, where the financing is coming from. And what you'll see is that it's not only a Singapore story, it's not only an ASEAN story, it's not only an Asia story, it's a global story. So we have financing traffic coming as far away from the US, Mexico, Alaska, Western Europe, Middle East, and also Asia as well. So we see that it is possible to actually create global outreach even if you're a local platform. And this has had some amazing outcomes for our campaigners as well. We had a campaigner which did a campaign for a mobile application. And he was telling us about how he was able to connect with really passionate gamers who had a gaming community in Mexico, and how they actually helped him fund his campaign to reach his target. And even 2 or 3 months after his campaign has ended, they continue to reach out to him on ideas on how to improve the game and so on. And this is a really good example of how you can actually build a globally relevant platform, even based here in a small market like Singapore. Now, it's not all easy. It's not all rosy, actually, right? A few of the key challenges that, with the risk of generalizing across 13 different countries and different markets and cultures and religions and languages, we see from our own experience, 4 key challenges which need to be addressed, right? And we see that the difference in success of a local platform is whether you address these needs or not, or whether you think that, a direct import and cookie cutter from the West is going to work. Now, if you look at risk appetite, headline, fear of failure. This is nothing new, but it's basically accentuated by the fact that people don't like to fail. But on top of that, basically, in Asia, you have this thing about loss of face. So you have a compounding factor where people are hesitant to press that publish button when they finish their campaign, or they don't want to have their face on videos when, we all know that you actually have to have a emotionally engaging video actually to gather support for your campaign, for example. And the fear of failure is one thing which needs to be addressed. Our lessons learned, ourselves, is that we really need to have value-add services. So the business model is not so much about solutions, it's also about services as well, to actually go that extra mile to make sure that campaigners are comfortable, they're a bit handheld, and you're offering the services and solutions that are going to set them up for success. The second thing is, we often talk about crowdsourcing or crowdfunding, but from my point of view, that's all in the narrow, right? We're all part of this thing about improving and enhancing the innovation ecosystem. And I'll talk a bit more about this later on, but the headlines here is that we're not US, we're not Silicon Valley, we're not Cambridge, for example. And the thing is that that incubation or innovation ecosystem here is extremely fragmented, and the players here are typically value slicers. What that means is that from an entrepreneur or a campaigner point of view, they might be able to raise money off of your platform, but the thing is they're stuck because they don't know how to reach out to resources or how to prototype or how to commercialize, because the transition to the next step is so fragmented and so difficult. And our lessons learned is that, on top of the transition business model, that we have to take on more of a value spanning mindset as opposed to a value slicing mindset, where we need to actually address the need and also the problem of our campaigners, which are innovators and entrepreneurs, as opposed to just single-mindedly saying that, we offer you crowdfunding, we offer you financing. Right. Third is support expectations. There is a very strong culture of transactional exchange, right? And this is very important to acknowledge this because as a platform operator, in order to drive volume and also revenue, I see some of our compatriots basically saying that we're like Groupon, right? This is like the death wish to crowdfunding, not only in ASEAN, but also, just for clarity, I think Groupon is a great business model. It's just that we don't want to be put in the same context. So the lessons learned is that in educating the market, we really have to distinguish between philanthropic consumption and returns, and really distinguishing these returns when we're also explaining the benefits to supporters as well. And the fourth point, regulation. And as regulation implies, I'm talking more about equity-based crowdfunding, but it's a gray area. And I'm saying it's a gray area just because that there's no specific regulation for crowdfunding as of yet. But I could tell you that Crowdonomic has a different approach for equity-based crowdfunding versus local players who want to get into this space, where our principle is that we want to do things above the line and our activities on equity-based crowdfunding are twofold. One is actually business building, but the other thing is also regulatory engagement as well. So half of my time, for example, is actually sitting down with central banks and also regulators to understand their needs, their concerns, to make sure that we're addressing them as opposed to doing things under the radar. But they are keeping a watchful eye, right? They are keeping tabs on what's happening in the industry, both here and also globally. And the thing is that they'll only possibly come up with regulation further down the line. And meanwhile, what's really important is that, we players in the industry here, exercise some self-restraint, self-governance, and professionalism, and have more of a partnership mindset as opposed to trying to scoot around the law. And so these are the key challenges. Now, this is like emerging trends, where we are today, how we got there. What I'd like to do for the next few slides is just share some ideas in terms of where we might be heading. Oh, let me recap first, actually. Local campaigns, growing number of gems and home runs. We had a brilliant talk from Silverline already, and I'm looking forward to hear about 3D printers as well. Local platforms lack scale, but we're actually on an accelerated growth trajectory. And positive dynamics, despite, or rather in spite of, really significant local challenges. So what does the future hold? So the three things, I'll start off with the first one that I'd like you to think about is convergence, right? Again, think about what the user needs. Think about what the user needs here in Asia, where the ecosystem is so nascent and so fragmented. Again, we talk about crowdfunding or crowdsourcing, but that's a business model explanation that we do as opposed to explaining a solution to a user. So this is a simple visualization of how the innovation ecosystem looks here. You have growth themes. Growth themes convert to ideas. Ideas, are solidified by business cases. Business cases gather financing. With financing, you could get resourcing, and with resourcing, you could build prototypes and so on and so forth, the growth financing stage. But the fact of the matter is that you have excellent players which are possibly playing at each step, but there's very little transition between each step. It's a fragmented process. And what I often see is that brilliant entrepreneurs basically stuck, either in the business case stage or the seed financing stage or the resourcing stage, and they can't get further because there's no one to hand over to. Now, how is this real world complemented by the crowdsourcing and crowdfunding world? We have open innovation, which is addressing the earlier steps of innovation. We have crowdfunding, not equity, like reward donation, which is helping accelerate the business case and also the seed financing stage. We have crowd needs, for example, which is like Elance, like brilliant platforms out there, which are helping businesses with financing, reach out to people who are going to help out with their business. And then eventually we're going to have equity-based crowdfunding, which is going to basically take companies along the last stretch. But the thing is that what you have to realize about this picture is that we're not solving the fragmentation. We're actually just acting as an overlay to an imperfect real world. Now, the positive sign is that we're actually, across crowdsourcing, across open innovation, across different variants of crowdfunding, we're actually capturing end-to-end the innovation cycle as well. So the provocation here is, why would we, as operators of crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, rely and act as an overlay to an imperfect real world, whereas we could do something different? We could actually stop acting as different services and act as one, which would be like crowd-powered incubation, whereas we're not separate, disparate services, but we're actually modules within one service, which is addressing the need of incubation, where ideas come in. They're addressing the virtual world and they're spit out in terms of real businesses. And then the relationship with the real world changes. So the real world interactions were no longer overlays. Actually, the virtual world, the crowdsourcing, crowdfunding world is acting as the incubation ecosystem. And actually the real world is supplementing or augmenting this platform. So that's one thought for you to think about. Provocation number 2. Why couldn't we have more sponsored crowdfunding? As part of our work at Crowdonomic, we actually work with a lot of corporates and institutions to think about how they could use crowdfunding. And the game-changing mindset is that it's no longer about individual entrepreneurs. It's not only about individual entrepreneurs or people who are tinkering, inventing stuff in their room. Actually, big corporates are stuck with the topic of innovation, developing game-changing technologies. I could give you a few examples of why. It's because some of the companies here, massive rate of expansion and growth, but originally, their DNA is in component or assembly, for example. Then you have big multinational companies which are at the forefront of innovation, and suddenly they come here and realize that the needs of Asian consumers is very different. Now, as a result, what's happening is that institutions are realizing more and more that innovation no longer happens within the laboratories, no longer solely within the R&D centers, and they're starting to realize the benefit of tapping into external communities. Now, one example is if you took your phone, right? The reason why you buy your phone or what you appreciate about your phone is, maybe 30 or 40% about form factor, functionality, and so on. But a lot of the daily usage and what you feel attractive is also driven by the software and also the apps as well. And these apps software are primarily driven by external communities. So what we see as something as game-changing here, which is going to happen here in the region, and possibly lead the trend, globally as well, is where institutions actually leverage crowdfunding to drive innovation through their external communities. Now, it's a benefit for our institution as well, because it's a different dialogue or a level of engagement that they could have with their consumers, right? Now, I've had feedback before that, this is already happening with crowdsourcing, and I say yes, it is, and that's a great thing. I think one different element that crowdfunding would bring in is that the dedication or ownership of the dialogue or the person you're having that dialogue with is different. You're actually having dialogues with consumers who are putting in money against campaigns which are going to fuel innovation for your brands and products. So we see sponsored crowdfunding, which is something, has great potential in the region and could, lead as a trend, globally. The third is equity crowdfunding. For Asia, I think is going to be lead or bleed, basically. Now, this is actually the topic I have most to say about, actually, just because of all the interactions we have with the key stakeholders, as well as all the emerging platforms here in Asia that we have, contacts with. And what I'd like to say still is that it's an open canvas, right? But as we've seen in the UK with the FCA or what we see with the SEC in the US, regulators actually have a huge role to play in this space. And what we see is, my feel is that they're progressive, but increasingly getting nervous. And the reason is that, we see time and time again clever plays. Like, I think I was just reading news that someone tried to sell their shares over Taobao, which is like the eBay of China, for example, which is, regulation aside, which is something quite brilliant, but, it's not something which is going to help fuel the standardization and growth of the industry. And I continue to see businesses where, we have companies set up in Asian countries, but all the back office operations are managed out of tax havens. I can tell you if there's someone trying to do that, in this room, good luck, because I've seen the last 5 years, 4 or 5 businesses try this model and all fail. So, we are, in a sense, ruining it for ourselves, but also, we also have the opportunity to actually lead the growth by setting professional standards, and those professional standards are going to actually drive healthy growth. And we actually still have the opportunity to capitalize on the goodwill of regulators and other key stakeholders actually to develop global platforms here, whereas other platforms are typically domestically restricted. So just to recap, opportunity for Asia to take on its own growth story, right? I think the key here is that for crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, we no longer really need to follow what's happening in Silicon Valley, New York, or London. We can actually define our own story, right? What's going to fuel that, what's going to actually define that or stop us is either the lack or actually reinforcement of our imagination and also our dedication to making it happen. I feel that the key growth drivers are going to be around convergence, around business model innovation, and key to equity-based crowdfunding is going to be that professionalism needs to outpace opportunism. Okay. Now, I know most of you came into the room wanting to see a number, say, a forecast in terms of how big the industry is going to be. So how big could the future be? Okay, I'm going to disappoint you and then excite you at the same time. So on the left-hand side, the 2.7 billion, those of you who have bought the Mass Solution Report, absolutely brilliant. If you don't have it, please buy it. Know that 2.7 billion is the global amount of funds raised, right? If you look at the right-hand side, the 2 billion that I showed earlier is the amount of capital circulated for informal venture capital only in Singapore, right? If you actually activated this through business model, service model innovation, we actually have the chance to grow from 1% to close to 30 or 40% right away through activation. And this is where I want to encourage, people who are thinking about setting up platforms, people who have already set up platforms to stop following, used and business models overseas, innovate, because the potential in the region is significant. Thank you.